let me invite the panelists to come forward. You'll see we have a patient representative, 2 people from the industry, and 1 academic, and 1 representative of academic medicine. Why don't we start with you, Kevin?
Oh, okay.
The eminent flexible character here.
So hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Bugin. As Barbara mentioned, I'm with Amgen. I'm the head of global regulatory policy and intelligence there. I've actually only been there for about a year and a month. So prior to that, I was at the FDA in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Office of New Drugs. I was the head of operations. Also had the privilege and honor of being within Operation Warp Speed. I was the chief of staff to Janet Woodcock for the therapeutics response effort. While we were doing all those miraculous things with vaccines, we were also trying to accelerate the discovery and development and manufacturing of therapeutics, because not everyone will take a vaccine or can take a vaccine, so that was an important effort as well. And I think that's what probably led me to this table today, because it was that lived experience of trying to accelerate and launch clinical trials. While they were mostly U.S. trials, there was still some efforts and considerations for global multi-regional clinical trials that made me realize this system for clinical trial and clinical evidence generation is broken, and we kind of all know this. I mean, actually, it works quite well when it works well, but the reality is that model that was created, 50 years ago really isn't able to keep up with the scale and the pace of innovation that we have today. So I think, John's remarks this morning, his personal experience and his family's experience reminds us that, biotech is hope, and that this is a process. It's not something that we're ever going to be done. We're going to constantly be chasing after these cures. But we've got to make sure the evidence generation system is fit for purpose and can keep up with the innovation and the discovery system. Because, at my company, and I think I'm not alone, at many companies, they're deploying new technologies, new approaches for biotech. They can take a molecule, even a known current molecule, and molecularly redesign it and reposition it, and they can target it all over the body in different ways, reducing toxicities and treating previously, untreatable diseases, because they can get to these previously undruggable targets. But the reality is we still need to generate the clinical evidence, because this is, a science. This is not perfection that you can create in a lab or in a computer simulation and then everything just works. So when I think about, some of the, clinical trial reforms that John Crowley mentioned earlier, I think about trial designs, and he mentioned this too. We have to make sure we're leveraging these innovative designs, whether that be the adaptive seamless trial designs, which I think may be the only way you can do clinical trials in certain diseases where you have small patient populations. Secondly, we have to be thinking about decentralized and more pragmatic or simple trial designs, because this is what patients demand. They don't want to go back into the clinic for every single visit, every single assessment. There's some expectation that some can be done online or virtually, or that they can go to their nearby lab or their nearby provider to get certain procedures done. And we have to incorporate that. And sites can't handle it either. They need to be able to conduct, clinical trials in their current routines, in their current workflows. If they have to wait until the end of the day to go and enter all of their data into, 7 different EDC systems for 7 different sponsors for those different trials, they're going to get home, they won't see their family, it'll be midnight. That's just not realistic, and it creates burden. And I think that's why you have the phenomenon that we have, where a lot of investigators become one and done. I think the percentages these days are something around 20 or 30% of investigators do one clinical trial and then they don't do any more. So we need smarter designs that allow us to seamlessly integrate clinical research into clinical care, more routine clinical care. I think that's the first piece. The second, and this is where MRCT comes in, I think this is a global challenge as well, right? We need alignment that it's not enough for, say, the US FDA to say we're open to innovative clinical trial designs. And I know this because I was at the US FDA and I was part of the Center for Clinical Trial Innovation, and that's what we did. We went out and we tried to say, on the road, hey, we're open to innovation and we want to see these types of designs. And we need to take that globally, though. We need to make sure across different regions we understand, receptivity and readiness for these designs. And it's not always that the regulator is the one holding it back. There are real challenges when you get to the sort of health systems or the site levels across different countries where maybe decentralization isn't quite as possible as it may be in other countries, or the pragmatic designs. And that's because EHRs are always different, and of course sponsors and their EDCs are always a little bit different too. One thing I do worry about, and I think John Crowley mentioned this also, is sort of the over-competitiveness that I think we're starting to see on the global stage. Each country is competing for its own piece of the clinical trial data pot, and they want more patients, and more trials within their countries, and so they're creating policies, requirements, and mandates, whether that be sort of for registration or even for access and payment later. That's just making it more complex and harder for sponsors and researchers, anyone trying to do a multi-regional clinical trial, to figure out, how do I do this? If I need 20% here and 20% there and 20% there and 20% there, and I can keep going and I can keep going, these numbers don't add up. There's only so many patients, so many places, and we can't do, and also if the requirements to do a trial are so different in different countries, we can't really do this. So I think we need to work on harmonization at the global level, and we need to really look at these different policies around competition and boosting clinical trials across the world, and make sure that those are appropriate and fit for purpose. And I think lastly, just we have to remind ourselves that our most precious commodity is our patients, and I'm glad Bridgette is on the panel with us today. Their time is valuable. We need to think about their experience in clinical trials, and I think it needs to be an experience that everyone should be offered. That's the first problem. Most patients aren't even asked to participate in a clinical trial because probably their provider isn't able to access a clinical trial and doesn't maybe have the knowledge of those clinical trials. But we need to make sure that the process to even participate is not one that's burdensome, causes challenges around, can I get insurance to cover these procedures, and my provider can't cover those procedures, so maybe it costs me more to actually participate in a trial, and that shouldn't be the case. We should be really treating those patients who do that extra step of going into a clinical trial with much greater respect, and ensure that their participation is truly an honor that it is, and that it's not more burdensome, more costly, and more complex for them to participate. So maybe I'll stop there and leave it to the others.
Thank you. Bridgette, from the patient perspective.
Well, good morning, everyone. 23 years ago, I was diagnosed with gastrointestinal and gynecological cancers. Even one of those cancers, most people would have been gone within 5 years of that diagnosis. I was at the University of Chicago preparing for graduate school in art history, and the doctors, or I refer to them as like the team that was there for me, centered me. Not only because I was a patient, not only because I had cancer in various organs, that they all had various specializations in and getting to those cancers and removing them from me. But they centered me in explaining to me what was happening, why it was happening, what they were going to do about it, not only from the perspective of my colon, gallbladder, liver, uterus, left fallopian tube, and right ovary, but also from the perspective of I'm a person and I need to be able to understand what's going on so that I can come along in this journey with them. So I'm perfectly fine 23 years later. I have a 19-year-old who's just starting at Williams College in neurobiology. And I started a company 5 years ago now, in 2020, because I was an art historian and a professor of art history as well as a curator, but I decided in 2018 to change careers and go into biotechnology and bioethics, and then get a law degree, and then start a company. And I decided to do that because the experience that I had saved my life. I didn't know before my diagnosis that someone could be diagnosed with cancer and then live to talk about it. I never experienced it. My grandmother died from colon cancer. I had other people in my family that died from bone cancer. So all I knew is that you get a diagnosis of cancer, you get your affairs in order, and 2 years later, you are now at that person's funeral. So the notion that I was actually surviving, and every doctor I had told me, I've done this 100 times, Mr. McCullough, you're gonna be fine. We're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, and you're gonna be fine. I even had one, my GI surgeon, Dr. Alverdi, who told me as a means of consoling me because I was convinced that I was going to die, even though I stayed with them all and thought I would just simply lean into them because they were the experts, they knew what they were doing, and they were also telling me that they were the experts and they knew what they were doing, and that I could just simply sort of let go and surrender and just follow their lead. And he told me that myself, as well as people that were in my generation, will live to 120 years old. And of course, I was super excited about that because I always figured that I would just never die. But, and I asked him why, and he said, because of medicine and technology. Well, that was in 2002. That was in July of 2002. And by 2004, I started hearing about CRISPR-Cas9 and how that is a game changer, and then other precision medicines and other technologies. And I thought, what happened to me where my life was saved, spared, given a whole new lease on life? That needs to be the case for every single person. And I was a graduate student and poor. So it wasn't like I had this super expensive, really good health insurance and had a trust fund that I can just fund my life being spared. But they gave every bit of it to me, every test, every procedure, a 6-hour surgery. They did everything without question. And this is the University of Chicago. And they even said to me that once we remove everything, if there's a chance that we'd have to use something like a chemotherapy or radiation treatment, we're not going to do that because we want to spare your reproductive organs in case you decide later you want to have a child. So we're going to do a plant-based alternative to chemotherapy that we're testing out here. You think you'd be interested in that? I was like, yeah, of course I would be. And I was fortunate in that my graduate committee, the chair of my committee, the two co-chairs of my committee, and one of the other professors in the art history department were also cancer survivors. One of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, one of colon cancer, and the other one of uterine. So for me, I looked at all of that and I thought that I'm a very spiritual person. And so I thought, God is allowing this to happen to me for a reason, and I don't know quite yet what that reason is, but there's a reason why I have all of these resources around me, and these resources being these doctors and surgeons and researchers. And so when they asked for all of my family's medical and health history, Dr. Fume Alapade asked for that, I got everybody in my family on my mother's side, and got all of their information and gave all of that to them. So that made me started thinking like, well, I'm helping them to collect all of their data. I'm gonna just fast forward this because I started ACIRAH with the idea that it would be like Dr. Alverdi, Dr. Cohen, Dr. Swartz, all of them, it's like 8 of them, that I would do what was done for me. Go into Black communities, focus on Black women, women of color, white women in rural communities, collect all their data, have them to self-report it to me, and have them at the ready to be in clinical trials at every top R1 research institution in this country. And I'd start with the University of Chicago and then just go around the country and talk to Stanford, Harvard, every top research university to create an access between that community as well as that university. Because to me, it just seemed unreasonable to ask a doctor and a researcher to not only design and be the architect of a clinical study, but then to go out and go get the people to be in that study as well and the trouble of having to get them to understand what a clinical trial, what informed consent is, to do all of that, I figured I can do it. And I had other platforms. So I look at life as tribes constantly band together. Well, the other tribe that I belong to is the art world. And so I put on events at every museum, every major museum here in the US as well as in Europe. Why? Because I worked as a curator at every one of all the ones that I worked with, that I partnered with. Then I went to a pharmaceutical company, and it was Pfizer. And why did I choose Pfizer? Because the Black community loves Pfizer. Absolutely loves Pfizer. And you know why? Because in the 1980s, Essence magazine would put on the Essence Jazz Fest, right? The music fest. And Pfizer was there, passing out information about diabetes, heart disease, and all those things like that, while Stevie Wonder is blaring in the background. So I thought, okay, let me talk to Pfizer. And I went to Pfizer, told them what I wanted to do, why I wanted to do it, how it would be very easy. I have a digital platform, so everything is digitized, and you can get everybody's information because they're self-reporting everything. Then I brought in all the cosmetic companies that I've either worked for or worked with, like La Mer, Jo Malone, Augustinus Bader, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, and Gucci, all of them, because they have a business model of giving all of their products for free, and they will have a customer for the rest of that customer's lives. And so what ACIRAH does is give those products to the people who become a member of ACIRAH. We have events, doctors, researchers, pharmaceutical people, pharmaceutical scientists are on those panels and talking about why you should be in a clinical trial. In the matter of 3 years, we have over 10,000 women across the country as members of ACIRAH, all waiting to be in clinical trials. So
That's great.
Yeah.
Really amazing. So that is, sort of a very positive story from the patient perspective and somebody motivated to really make a difference in this. Karen, I wonder if you could tell us
Sure.
how easy it is at the academic institutions now to really fulfill the promise that we all intend to commit to.
And now that's a tough question, Barbara. As far as easy, just a little bit of background. I lead our clinical research, clinical trials teams, as well as our shared services. And my first career was a nurse, and so I've seen firsthand what research does and making a difference for patients, which is why I'm passionate about the work that I do. And then also thinking about taking it to the patient perspective, what we're looking at within clinical research and clinical trials we've started on this over the last year and over the next couple of years, is really taking a look at how do we significantly decrease that activation timeline. Sponsors obviously are engaged in that as well. We're doing some different things. We're connecting with sponsors directly to offer different accelerated pathways. We've been able to activate some trials in 8 to 10 weeks, and we've been able to bring that therapy to patients really quick. We prioritize those trials. We take a look at it, and we identify from our leadership team, these are the trials we want to move quickly on, whether they're investigator-initiated or industry-initiated. And then we have other pathways that we go through. So that's number one. And then number two, a little bit to Kevin's point, and hear what Bridgette was saying, is how do we integrate trials into the practice, into clinical practice? It is very often that patients aren't even presented a clinical trial opportunity, except perhaps more in the oncology or hematology in the cancer area. Some of that is workflows. Physicians, providers are moving so quickly in between rooms to see patients. They're not taking the time, or they don't have the time to think about, how do I mention a clinical trial or provide an opportunity for a clinical trial? So we have two of our physician leaders really engaging and identifying, how can we make workflows simpler within our practice? How do we take a look at integrating clinical trials right as patients are making appointments and asking about opportunities or interest in clinical research? How do we share what clinical research is all about, similar to what you're doing with your members, but to think about that connection. We're significantly offering opportunities for decentralized capabilities. And what we're doing there is really taking a look at where can we pivot some clinical trial visits to be able to offer remote visits, video visits, remote biospecimen collection. And that is actually twofold. One, selfishly for practices, you are reducing the footprint in the practice and allowing that exam room open for another patient. And that physician, that clinician, that provider who's doing the research visit is doing that likely in their office on the video screen and being able to see the patient and collect the information that way. And so we're significantly pivoting. About 600 of our active 2,500 clinical trials have decentralized capabilities, and we're trying to increase that every day so that we can think differently in that aspect. And then lastly, I think, how are we looking at new trial models? How can we do, as Kevin was talking about, pragmatic trials, thinking about utilizing real-world evidence and look at the data before we design trials to make sure that we bring the right type of trial and hopefully reducing some of the complexity of the trial to be able to bring those types of trials to our patients. And what can we learn from the data that we have, that we've already collected over years of patients' lives within our medical records and through our Mayo Clinic platform from that perspective. I think that all touches on what John was talking about. We have to, as a research ecosystem, reduce time, reduce cost, and reduce complexity. Those really hit with me as he mentioned that. And I think those are where we have opportunities.
That's terrific. Thank you. Anne.
Yes.
Go for it.
Sure. So I'm Ann Meeker-O'Connell. I am 3.5 months into a new role at Novartis. Like Kevin, I left the agency. And what really struck me this morning is it reminded me of the reason that I got into clinical research. I didn't know what it was. I was in a lab doing molecular pharmacology and knew I didn't want to be standing in a walk-in freezer for the rest of my life, and started looking at other opportunities. And a friend introduced me to the concept, and I thought, yes, this is really what I want to do. This is a much more tangible connection to the translation of molecular insights into things that will actually benefit patients. So I've been at FDA actually twice. The first time was in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and doing a lot of the things that we've touched on. How do we find ways to make trials simpler? How do we make them more feasible to implement? And it strikes me that back in 2010, 2011, we were having some of the same discussions, that the cost of clinical trials was increasing, their complexity was impeding the ability to do additional trials and to bring additional therapies to patients. And so there are likely things that we have in our toolkit, things like quality by design, which the agency worked with other health authorities to develop and is now kind of embedded in guidelines that we could take advantage of that allow us to do many of the things that we're talking about. Streamline designs, make sure we've stripped them from some of the things that are non-essential, so that we are designing trials that are less complex, because that complexity has a tendency to beget errors, and it also, our design choices, patients and sites bear the burden of that complexity. So I think, to my mind, there's an element of looking at what we have and looking at kind of change management so they're applied more broadly. The second role, the role at FDA I had that I just left, was in the commissioner's office running the Office of Clinical Policy. And there was a lot of focus on some of the things Kevin has already touched on. How do we advance evidence generation? But I want to touch on something that was really core to the office that I led, which is patients and informed consent and how patients can get access to trials. So I think we have opportunities, and I know there's a whole portion of the discussion which is makes me just delighted later this afternoon on how we can streamline consent, because I think that is the first point that somebody may actually encounter a trial. And if we make it complex, if we make it cumbersome, that may actually result in somebody not participating. And at the agency, I had patients telling me that informed consents that are only long, some of them describe them as insulting because that we hadn't taken the time to provide information in a way that was digestible and understandable. I also think there are opportunities to think about access in terms of being able to find a trial that is of interest. So if I think about it, I got in last night a little bit late and was looking at what do I want for dinner. Let me go to Grubhub. I could quickly identify not only what cuisine do I want a falafel wrap, I don't want it in a pita, I want it this kind, and kind of find just the right restaurant. Where is that we could give to people who are interested in participating in trials to help better connect people with research? So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So again, we're going to go back and ask a few questions, which is just let me start. So one of the questions is sort of everybody's talked about harmonizing, simplifying, making things more efficient. That requires all of our bespoke systems in some ways to come together, remodel, which we're not very good at. We're good at tacking on, but not moving away. You know, and we feel that from at companies who have to deal with, 195 different national laws and regulations, with different agencies that have different requirements, that have different forms for different EHRs, that have, and then you get to the academic centers that have to deal with 110 different platforms for 60 companies or 12 companies, and every time they work with somebody, it's a new platform and a new tack on. And then we get to sort of all the data systems that we understand poorly. How are we going to bring this together? How are we going to achieve what sounds like great principles, but practically very, very difficult? Where does that come together? And, who's God here that can do that work? So.
Wow, you'll make it
Kevin.
easy to start. Well, I'm not God of anything, but I think there's a beginning. I'm actually going to use a term that Sir Martin Landry came up with. So he was the PI for the recovery trial during COVID. I'm not saying he's God either and going to solve this, but he once said, I think it's not that we need to decentralize clinical trials, it's that we need to centralize the complexity. So, and I think, Karen, you also mentioned this, creating hubs for the technology infrastructure that's needed to run the clinical trial processes for all of the additional sites, within a network. So it's almost like a hub and spoke model. Like that could be a key to unlocking some of the complexity, because then if you can solve the EDC integration for your health system in that one central location, you've solved it for all of the, dozen or so sites that you might have within the health system. It doesn't solve the issue of, still there's, I think on average, the majority of sites have, and I said 7, but it's probably like 20 different EDCs that they're working with. That issue needs to be solved, and that probably will come with data standards and thinking about interoperability with regards to both the data that's captured in our EHRs, but also the data that we need for, whether it's the clinical trial or real-world evidence type studies. I think if you can simplify and standardize there, then you make that problem easier, because then the sponsors don't really have a need to have their own unique sort of versions of the EDC, or even if they do, they're probably at least easier to use and could, through modern API type technologies, interface into a common platform in their workflows, which I think is going to be key. So maybe, again, centralize in order to decentralize the access. That's probably, I think, going to be the key, is pulling that complexity as close into one location as possible.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, I think if we all even could commit to think about one thing each of us could do to think differently or reduce complexity. Something really simple that we're doing now with building relationships with pharma partners, site qualification visits. why do you need to come to a site or do a qualification visit 10 times a year for 10 different studies? Can you do one qualification visit and then the uniqueness of each study, maybe you have something unique that has to happen in a study, a certain type of test, certain type of procedure, certain type of data collection. But the rest, do one qualification visit a year. You've reduced that redundancy, reduced the workload for the study team and also for the sponsor team. So we're thinking about, we've gotten 2 or 3 sponsors already, more jumping on and saying, that's a great idea. Why haven't we started thinking about this before? And any of those little things, as soon as we can start doing that, thinking about direct EHR to EDC data transfer, where can we think about that? Our clinical research coordinators are burdened. They're trying to figure out seeing patients. They have study visits, and just as you said, at the end of the day, they're trying to put data into 10 different EDCs with 10 different logins that they have to really basically list out on their sheets of paper to say, okay, I'm going to log into this system with this password, this system with this one. We're trying to figure out how can we do single sign-on for them from our site perspective to make some things easier as well. So I would think as a community, let's challenge ourselves to think of those 1 or 2 things, and as soon as we get one, let's add another and another, and we'll start seeing some reductions in redundancy and hopefully moving along quicker.
So do you think, similar to FDA trusting the inspections of other countries, that companies could trust the qualification from another company and then bring on just the unique aspects? Or do you think each company needs to do it initially?
I think that's a great point. I would ask that question of the 2 company and any of the sponsors in the room, the pharma. What would be your comfort on that perspective?
And what would we need to do to establish the authenticity and validity of the qualification?
I think that's the key last piece. So I'll speak as Kevin Bugin, not as maybe a ClinOps representative from Amgen. My experience is that a lot of times you go and you do the site visit or you do an initial feasibility survey, you're going to get information back, but then when you come to eventually activate the site, things have changed. Personnel have turned over, maybe there's a new requirement even in the study design that you didn't initially assess for. And so the reality is how do we just make it much more dynamic and real time and transparent? And I think if there were certain standards, that would be a huge help as well, that at least you can draw from that. Most companies, and I think Amgen is one company that is doing this, are leveraging as much prior data and experience as they can on site capabilities to model out initially. So before we even go and do some of the feasibility assessments, we already have an idea of, will this be a potentially good site and a high enroller? And I think the more we can do that and figure out what's the data that enables those types of models, that will be helpful across the board.
And how to make that, continue to make that data dynamic, because institutions change, and just as they get worse, they get better.
Yeah.
So, interesting. Does industry have one common sort of data standard for the kinds of information that it wants from the academic or the site perspective? And couldn't that be another simplification? You have one sort of standard, and then you can tack on the individual issues? Go ahead.
I think there have been, I think every company will have a slight variation, but I think there have been, and I think I see Andy Lee kind of chomping at the bit to kind of contribute, and so I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but there have been efforts, for example, through Transcelerate to look at how do we kind of have that process simplified. I don't know, Andy, if you want to speak to it.
Yeah, many years ago, so I'm Andy Lee. I'm formerly from Merck and other companies. I'm recently retired and an advisor to MRCT. I was a founder member of Transcelerate, and one of the early projects we took on was looking at standardization of GCP training, standardization of many things, one of them being site feasibility. So that still exists, it's available, it can be done. And we encourage companies to do this to lower the burden on sites. So that's a general feasibility that can be done, and it asks whether you have, Wi-Fi connectivity and -70 freezers and all that stuff that should be in a repository, and we should all be able to access just instantly at the click of a button because you all have it at sites. With respect to the sponsor-specific sort of requirement at study startup, Most of the stuff is what I'd call horizontal. It's the same for every study. It's access to, systems, tools, process, and all those things. But the protocols are unique, and they have unique characteristics of the staff that are needed, the equipment that's needed, and that is the part that has to be done on each visit, and it has to be done because it's inspected. And Anne, you know this from the inspectorate, is people come and see, what did you do in startup, and when did you declare site ready? And you have to have checked those boxes. It said, we checked this, we validated that, we did that in the pre-study startup visit. So those things are standard because they're in the regulations and people are inspected on that. And if you haven't done them, it delays your product to get approved, and you have all sorts of problems. I think what I've heard here from an industry perspective is there's a lot of standardization and distillation into common themes. So common EDCs, the three predominant EDCs are Medidata and the Oracle and the Viva. Those are about 95% of the EDCs that are used. So people don't use, hundreds of EDCs. They use very few, and they're trying to distill down into set numbers of vendors. What industry is also doing is they're looking at all the things that people have discussed on the board here, from decentralization to this to that. But you can't do all of those things in every trial. So what you have is a potpourri. And what we look at in industry, and this is from peers and colleagues as well, so the generic form of this is you look at verticals which are bespoke for a protocol. So certain disease areas require you to do certain things. And so you don't put that in every protocol. You do that vertically that's needed for one. And then the horizontal stuff is, how do you find small efficiencies? So if you can find a 2 or 3% efficiency through a process improvement or using AI or something, and you do that in the 100 protocols you prosecute, that's a massive change in efficiency. Yeah. So you can't do everything in every trial. And I think where people get lost is they're trying to do all of these things that they're suddenly going to see a 30% efficiency, and it's not going to happen. What you need is immense discipline. And sites need to be disciplined in the way they work with sponsors and say, this is our process that works well for us. We would prefer to work this way. And sponsors will say, oh, we get it. Sites prefer to work this way. Let's work together with them. And I think this partnership is where you'll see the efficiency. But too often sponsors bring in brand new teams who all want to reinvent the wheel. And we don't get enough feedback from the sites. And there should be that pushback on some of the sponsors. Is we've done this before. We're very experienced and skilled. And in our system, this is what works better. And as soon as sponsors can understand that's the best and efficient way of sites to work, they'll adopt those policies. But in the absence of pushback, they'll just ask you to do something just because they can. So I think one has to look very carefully. It would be useful to sit down and work collectively with sponsors, and I think Transcelerate's a good forum for that. And I think there are other forums as well. Society of Clinical Research Sites gives a lot of very valuable feedback to sites on how to work together. And what is happening now is because of site saturation, sites can choose. And the sponsors that come with the most complex protocols do not get chosen. Their protocols get pushed aside. So I think the number one thing that was raised today is the reduction in protocol complexity. And that is something that IRBs really need to take a close look at. Is there should be burden scores, and there are tools and technologies available now to assess the protocol, to help generate protocols quickly, and to tell what's redundant in the protocol, and then decisions need to be made. And that redundancy has a burden on the site, it has a burden on the data collection, on the queries, on the downstream inspections, everything. And so I think the number one thing is complexity of protocols that needs to be simplified.
Is there an industry accepted standard metric for burden? Or there are metrics, but is there?
There's no standard metrics yet. Ken Getz is obviously doing a lot of work on this, and he's got some interesting data. His data is often forward-looking. It doesn't look in the back office of what the burden is in sponsors, and it's huge. So decentralization makes it easier on the front end and what's visible at sites and with patients, but it's very complex on the back end and very costly. So trying to get that transparent balance on what it all looks like is not that easy.
Yeah, and I think there are some available, I'm not focused so much on do we have kind of the perfect score. I think you get kind of the readout of whether your trial is too complex if you have sites that don't want to participate or patients that don't want to enroll. I think that upfront complexity, though, in thinking about it at design, there are actually resources available through CTTDI. There are some of the practices, like what are the simple practices you could do as you're designing your trial to walk through, what question are we answering? What data do we need to answer that question? Do we need to go collect them, or are they somewhere else? So, I agree with Andy that kind of tackling that will help a lot of downstream issues. The other thing that strikes me, because you mentioned inspections, is that we could map out the process for the, whether it's startup or looking at trial conduct and all of the things that we do, and really make a concerted effort to say which ones are actually required by regulation and which ones are things that have grown out of how we do things. They've become embedded. We can't get rid of them because we've always done it, and then we assume that they are a regulatory requirement when in fact they're not. I think that exercise could yield a lot of low-hanging fruit for trimming.
I'll just add on to the complexity component. We've had some discussions with sponsors, completely agree, Andy, and they'll say, we had KOLs give input, and they said this was great and this was great, and this is how we should do that. But if you take a look at that, sometimes that's your physicians who aren't in the operations, and they don't understand some of the operational complexities. One key example is a protocol came in, and the sponsor was saying, all these sites are declining this. Why? Well, because you've asked us to draw blood here and have it spun and ready to go in 10 minutes. It's just not feasible. Tell us the site who said yes to this, So those are the types of things, if you think from an operational perspective, I think we would have an opportunity to, and that right there, that slows down activation because it's churning back and forth of how do we do this differently.
And I see Sylvia wants to introduce
Well,
some online questions.
I'm not sure, because I know Andy was going to respond to that, but I also wanted to bring in the room from Casey around CDISC standards and the e-investigator site file standard to supplement the trial master file standard, so that there's work being done to standardize some of this, and there's an entire initiative that she's working on. So I think that's another place where we can be certainly dealing with redundancy. So wanted to bring that into the room in case that's relevant. But Andy, I know you wanted to perhaps respond back to what Karen was saying there too.
And while you're passing the microphone, I never disagree with Andy, except when you say that DCT, decentralized clinical trials, are easier for the sites and institutions, they're not.
Harder initially.
Just to say, they're easier for the
patients.
They're easier for patients. You said both.
Yeah,
I just want to.
Sometimes that's the data that's presented.
Yeah,
the data
I know.
that's presented by Ken is around sites and patients. It's not about the back office.
No,
That's
it's
my
not
point.
about the back office, but
And the back office
the
is
intermediary is
really-
a
yeah.
mess.
But what
Yeah.
I wanted to comment on was this thing of access to data. So the other big innovation will be on the AI components, which we'll learn more about, and we're learning every day. But every protocol that's written for every therapeutic area is now available. It's digitized. You can suck it out of the web pages and everything. All the regulations are public and can be reviewed. Using agentic AI, you can pull all that data and you can generate a protocol within 1 to 2 days. You can do it in hours, actually. And from that, you can start with a blank slate and say, as we build a brand new protocol, we start from zero, and then you build and add in, and you can build that schedule of activities, the SOA table, normally on page 90 or something in your protocol, and it builds that automatically, and it'll tell you the exact burden on what patient's burden is, what the site burden is, what research staff you need at the site, and it'll show you the cost linked to every ICD-10 code, etc. And it'll help you build a database in hours or so based on all of that. So this is where it's going to go. And so that speed up at study startup can happen. It's immature at the moment, but this is the promise and hope, is that we can actually get to getting through all this morass of things very quickly. And then there's a trade-off that says, these things are not needed. If you really want to have them, this is the burden that you're actually incurring. And it's of very little value. Yeah. And what my experience is in these exploratory companies is that the physicians are much more willing to listen to that discussion from the agentic AI generation of something, which may not be perfect, but it's directionally correct, than they are willing to listen to people who are non-physicians. Okay, so it's quite an interesting thing. The human interaction is much tougher than the machine production and the reaction to it. So I think there's promise in the tools and development of modern technologies to simplify protocols and visually demonstrate that burden and put it into people, skill sets, money, and back office data sets that you have to manage.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think, and maybe Andy is drawing from prior Transcelerate experience. I mean, there are efforts around what they call the digital data flow and thinking about digitizing protocols and being digital first. You know, the reality is most protocols don't begin as a thought of, I need this data to answer these research questions. They start as, what was the study done previously for this disease, and let me take that, and then I'll update this and I'll update that, and unfortunately that creates, you know, challenges down the road. And I think we're getting to the point, though, where it will be, okay, these are the research questions, these will be the data points that we need to answer those research questions, and you'll have a module for that, and then you'll have a module for the safety assessments needed based on the patient population, et cetera, and then you can slowly build, you know, in a digital-first format, your protocol. And I think there's ways to link that, and this maybe will come up later today, to your informed consent requirements, to your EDC requirements. And as you said, I think AI will be very good because it can keep, you know, millions of parameters, if not billions, in its mind, and it can model out how will this all work, and, you know, what will be the most efficient path to do this type of trial. And it can do, you know, complexity and burden scores as will be needed. I think it's a new day is coming down the road with regards to protocols and just the basics of how a trial is designed. I just think we also need to make sure we're thinking about the most fit for purpose, and you said vertically, you know, it'll be different for every disease, every molecule that you're studying. What's the appropriate design? Is it always just going to be the simplest RCT that I can do, or interventional, you know, RCT that I can do, or are there other designs where we can leverage the data being captured in routine care, and I can handle that on the complete seamless back end without even having to bother the clinicians potentially? Or, you know, are there those adaptive designs that can leverage, you know, the Bayesian approach so we can seamlessly move from smaller populations to largers, et cetera?
So I'm you know, interested in the kind of potential. The one thing I go back to is something that John Crowley said this morning about the circle and not forgetting about the patient in the center of the circle. So as we kind of leverage kind of agentic AI and other tools to build protocols, how do we make sure that we don't miss kind of the need, and kind of, if you look at ICH E8R1 and kind of the need to build in the perspective of those who might participate. What are the endpoints and outcomes that are meaningful to them, that we don't lose that perspective? So I'm interested in kind of your perspective on that as well.
Well, I think what we're doing at ACIRAH, we're working, we've created what we call a care model. That's where the patient's understanding of that, of what a clinical trial is, just the very basics of it, right? And then the various other components, one being informed consent, one being where the clinical trial is taking place, and actually being a part of the architecture of that study. That doesn't mean that every single patient is giving input to that, but that means that there is a representative, so to speak, of patients in general that's there sitting on. I'll use something that's actually happening. So ACIRAH is the principal researcher, and then I am the co-chairperson of the Patient Stakeholder Advisory Board for Celeste PCORI. It's a PCORI grant for menopause and insomnia, multi-site in 5 different states across the country. And so I'm involved with every aspect of designing and setting up that clinical study, coming absolutely from the perspective of the patient, all the way down to the language that's used in informed consent. So for example, informed consent is, I mean, if every patient went to medical school and then law school, now they know what informed consent is, right? But since I only went to law school and studied health law, I do, and there's doctors that are sitting there with me. So what I did in this one case is take a paragraph and have the paragraph there in the normal language, but then in italics have the meaning and the understanding of that paragraph in a language that I like to call Mr. Rogers, language that's really understandable, that you know what it is. Part of it, the inspiration that I had for that is when Dr. David Cohen, my reproductive endocrinologist, was talking to me about the cancer and what's happening. He was using medical language as he was talking to me. Doesn't mean that he thought that, you're a graduate student at the University of Chicago, so you just have to know. I know you know what I'm talking about. He knew I didn't know what he was talking about. But once he told me his language, he then started to explain to me, this is what that means. This is what the tumor looks like. This is what the cancer looks like. Even once they removed everything, the pathology department took pictures of everything. So I got to see what everything looked like. So I knew the inside of my body almost as well as they knew the inside. So I think if that patient is there or being involved in the development and the construction of something, that allows for much better integration with that patient.
Let me ask a question. Going back to the issue of the site visits and the repetitive site visits that are really duplicative, what's to stop industry from forming a consortium organization that would actually accredit clinical trial sites to a common methodology, and they would have an accreditation on all these different data collection, informed consent, staffing, adequacy, et cetera, and then if there were peculiarities of individual study protocols, then the company at that point could send somebody in to the site visit to do a site visit just on those kind of aspects that are peculiar to the particular protocol. I mean, that would certainly eliminate. It would have standards. It would adopt standardization of assessment of sites across the industry, and sites would be answerable to one standard.
Similar to AHARP when you think about it.
Exactly,
in that
exactly for human subject protections. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you might clarify, is it a legal barrier or is there something else?
No, there is no legal barrier. It's a non-price term, so it's not an antitrust violation, right? The question is, I mean, it's an operational question, really. Yeah.
So there was an effort started in 2012 with Frida Lewis Hall and Clay Johnston, who was exactly trying to do that. Christine Pierre was still alive at the time, and so there was a lot of effort around accreditation. They brought in people that had done accreditation, and then it was decided that it would become a barrier. I mean, especially now when we need so many more new sites in places where we've never had sites. It was considered to become a barrier, and they created a set of, and I think the National Academies did a working group on it, but there's a set of sort of like, these are the things you may have, and sites sort of look at that and sort of tell, like, that's how they get ready. But it was a decision at the time, and maybe that decision should be revisited, that it was not in the best interest of sites because the barriers were already so hard to get started. This would just add more. But, yeah.
But if it's voluntary, like AHARP accreditation, then
Well,
you
that's
could-
different. AHARP would be different. They didn't. I don't think AHARP was brought in. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting idea. Thank you. So let me pivot. John was sort of very positive about the environment and the opportunities. How do you, given your experience at the FDA, Kevin and Anne, and now in the industry world, how do you work with how do you predict how to work with what I think is an unpredictable FDA?
Great question. So maybe I'll tackle this from like my sphere, which is regulatory policy. And I think in a time like this where a lot of the policy staff, the purely policy staff, have been decimated. So, groups like Anne's group, and there are teams within different sort of drug product types, new drugs, generic drugs, et cetera. Those have been hit really hard. The staff that are still working day to day, reviewing applications, engaging with sponsors, researchers, they do policy work too, but it's not purely and primarily their responsibility. So I think the way we can help them, though, and help ourselves, is we can align better outside of the agencies and ensure we provide to them sort of a unified position around policy, as opposed to disparate positions and opinions within the same therapeutic area around endpoints or around trial designs. If we can come together and say, hey, FDA or EMA, whoever the regulator might be, across industry, and you never get everybody, but across industry, the majority have aligned that this, we think, is the best possible way to serve these patients in these cases, that's something for them that they can take and they can hopefully adopt and defend it and say, well, the rest of industry or most of industry is aligned with this. The same with bringing academic experts together to create those positions as well. That's something FDA may not be able to do. I mean, they haven't been taking many products to advisory committees, and I think the advisory committees they've still been having are a little interesting, is the word I think I heard this morning. So again, industry or the outside world, I wouldn't just say industry, but also the academic can do more to create that alignment that they can then bring to the regulators on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, and just to be clear, I'm 3.5 months out, so I don't interact with the agency because I'm still in my cooling off period. But I think there is.
You're chill.
Yeah, I'm chill. But I think in terms of, predicting, the thing I try to keep a focus on is not kind of all of the things that are changing, but the things that haven't changed, the things that kind of we still, there's, with the kind of day-to-day of designing and implementing and analyzing a clinical trial, we still have ICH guidelines. We still have kind of that focus, and also the fact that there is this interest in innovation and how do we meaningfully improve the timeline. So I try and kind of keep an eye on, there is predictability through the work that is done through these, global collaborations like ICH.
And just to annotate your response, Kevin, it would be even more powerful if we could get global regulators to agree on those outcomes and what validated endpoints would mean and, yeah. Yes, Kevin. You're getting a weapon in a minute.
So I like your idea, Kevin. I wonder, how would the industry come together? Like, would they have industry group standards for therapeutic area endpoints to decide, among the industry, what is the best one for a certain disease? Because usually it would be the FDA that kind of interviews or works, like those advisory panels would kind of work together to, pick those endpoints or decide what they want to see. And if they're not there to do that, then you're suggesting that industry do it, then there has to be some push for industry to get together and do it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, the reality is, if you're focusing on, say, therapeutic area specific guidance, the way that was generated in the past, I mean, to be quite frank, was individual development programs did a lot of the work, going out, meeting with key opinion leaders and experts, deciding what the endpoints might be, engaging with the FDA or other regulators one by one by one. And at some point, the FDA wakes up one morning and says, gosh, this was the 12th meeting this year where we talked about these endpoints. We've been copying and pasting the exact same advice back to these sponsors. We should just write it up in a guidance. And, so that's, then the guidance finally gets written, and it takes another 2 years to go through the processes of getting cleared and finally published, right? And then, it's a draft for a while, you get public comments, and there's a process to this. But I think that already took too long, and there were efforts to try and streamline that process, a couple years ago. Again, all that's probably halted now. But I think sponsors could come together. We're all probably interviewing the same KOLs, depending on the diseases, and make that process more transparent and public. And I don't think that there's, anti-competitive, antitrust type issues there if it's done in the right way. I mean, there are some cases where there are consortiums. Many cases they're run by the patient advocacy groups, which is probably the best way that could happen. But where there aren't, strong patient advocacy groups, maybe that's where industry could kind of provide some of the initial impetus to get the consortiums together to provide some of that guidance.
Yeah.
This sort of follows on your question a little bit, Barbara, but I mean, and some of the earlier comments by the panelists, but I guess to go back to Barbara's question of a minute ago, if we set aside the opening speaker's comments about optimism for the FDA is going, how do we really feel about where it's going if the goal is to achieve clinical trial reform, the title of this panel? Will the FDA have the willpower, the leadership, and the human resource and talent to see that through? Because if we talk about even some fundamental things like informed consent, because everybody hates informed consent, I'm with WCG Clinical, we're a big IRB. I've got to sit down across from an inspector and defend language in informed consent documents, and how do we get to the point where inspectors the FDA, I guess, as an agency, down to the level of the inspectors, they're willing to embrace reasonable common sense changes to improve clinical trials, from the big issues to the little issues?
I love this question because I think that's part of, we tend to think of reform and change as we put out a guidance or we put out a regulation, or in a company we put out a policy, we tick the box, it's done. Yay, we've made a change. And we often forget about the need for kind of mindset changes, kind of embedding within an organization. So in terms of, for me, when we were initially talking about predictability, I was thinking about it in terms of predictability of policy implementation. So we often see that kind of there's a root cause in not kind of making sure that change goes across and down within an organization. And so I think that's really an opportunity as well to think about, kind of as Kevin talking about those discussions that could be kind of cross-industry and kind of supporting, is to be able to call out those things where we have a kind of guidance or regulations or ICH that says this, and we're starting to see a little bit of divergence, and we're just flagging it.
Yeah, and if, I imagine, had the government not be in a current shutdown, the person currently running the day-to-day operations for the Center for Clinical Trial Innovation, or C3TI, might have been here. I would have probably recommended them to join our panel. That still exists. So that entity that was established a year or two ago is still there, and it's really focusing on that change management issue. It's not writing the policies for decentralized or more pragmatic trial designs. It's trying to harvest use cases and case studies and lessons learned and share those internally across the organization, also with the field, the inspectors, and also externally. And I think that's key, is we have to continue to talk about this, and we have to bring those groups together. And the more I think we do stay on this, that's always, change management is more about perseverance and managing the people side of the change than it is the specific change. I mean, I'm sure the innovative trial designs and protocol simplicity is the answer, but it's really about managing all of us through the process of adopting these tools, and that what we come out with on the other end of this won't be what we thought we were going into it with. And I think that's where C3TI is going to be helpful, and it becomes a knowledge management issue. I mean, risk-based monitoring, which are things I think, Anne, you worked on, does have those concepts around what are the critical, and you mentioned this, critical to quality aspects of this trial, and that those should be documented, and how are we managing the risks associated with those. And that's what the inspectors need to go out and inspect, not everything because they've got a checklist, but those critical to quality elements. And I'm sure that's still a process. That's not happening day to day. I mean, you guys tell me when you're dealing with the inspectors, but that's something that C3TI and other entities within the agency, they're still there, and they still are working on some of those things. If we can weather through this interesting time, I think, we'll be okay. It's perseverance.
Anna.
Hi. Great panel. I love it. Thank you. And I really like the fact that, we're kind of talking a bit more deeply about some issues that we've been talking about for a while, and there's some really cool new ideas, and I love it. So I have a very practical question and then a very much a pie in the sky question. Practically, I'm wondering who else do we need in this room? Yes, of course, maybe more of the companies hardcore in the AI space. But are there other people? I mean, is this like a Google and an AWS and like, some of these other tech companies to really help us with there? Because I know a lot of us are already working with some of these companies, but who else do we need in the room? I feel like we may be missing something. So that's kind of a practical question for the panel. My pie in the sky question, what's the resource need? Is this just, do we throw money at it? Do we lock some really smart people in a room for a week and just pound this out? Because some of these issues are things we've been talking about for years. And so I guess my question is what is that barrier? What do we have to jump over to actually get stuff done? We heard from John Crowley that there's leadership that's interested. I understand there's someone high at HHS who's really interested in clinical trial reform. We work with who we need to, but what do we need to jump? So kind of two different questions.
Thank you. Go for it.
I'll give an idea for who's not in the room that, and it's maybe thinking about what John said about kind of access is the kind of insurers or reimbursement, because when we've started to talk about let's design simpler trials, let's be less burdensome for patients and for sites, I'm reminded by people that that regulatory approval is only the first hurdle. And that, we know that particularly in Europe, there is a lot of interest from those who make decisions in actually what happens in design, the information they want. So I think having the kind of totality of people who have an interest up front in the design involved in the room would be helpful.
Yeah, and I was actually going to say, Office of the National Coordinator, but that's connected to reimbursement for Medicare and a lot of other insurance providers and payers. I think that's key, and you guys benefit because I think John Halemka was former ONC and went there. There have been efforts to kind of standardize most of the data that's collected, at hospitals and in healthcare. It's in order to get payment and reimbursement solved, right? It's not for our research purposes or for our learning health system, quality improvement, et cetera, purposes. That's slowly changed over the years, but it's those, I don't know if it's 3 vendors that Andy mentioned, but those vendors for the electronic health records kind of have a monopoly or triopoly over that process. And each time it's something they just bolt on. And I do think there's like a reimagining that needs to take place around what's the data we need to take care of patients in the best way possible and to enable clinical research, enable, reimbursement and payment and all those new things from a fresh sheet of paper. And I think that's going to upset a lot of, those EHR vendors probably who, I know some of them and they're great people. It's just, there have been systems built for decades on top of these things. And, CROs are another group, and I know there might be a couple represented here today who've got just huge business models and organizations built around how to enable trials as we currently do them today. And it's not that they don't want to do newer, better, more innovative, more patient-centric trials. It's just that those are different. And so it's a lot of change management involved in shifting these things.
I would just say from a practical perspective, Diana, to that, if you get too many, it takes too long. So think about, I think we need to think about who are those absolutes that have to be in the room, bringing something together, and then maybe bring in the next circle of who needs to be there. Because as you said, we've been talking about this a long time.
And with that, we're going to talk about it some more, but not at this panel. We're going to give you all a huge thank you for this panel.